So, I just graduated from college. You know how it is. You have this degree that you're told is your golden ticket, but in reality, all you have is a mountain of student debt and a resume that looks suspiciously empty. I was working a dead-end data entry gig, paying just enough to keep me from moving back in with my parents, which was my biggest fear. My life for 2 months was a cycle of cheap coffee, Craigslist apartment listings, and growing desperation. And then I found it. An apartment in a borough that wasn't exactly trendy, but it wasn't the middle of nowhere either. The ad said, "Cozy studio, great for a young professional, utilities included." The price was the real kicker. It was way too low. The kind of price that makes you think either the ad is a scam, or the place is a biohazard. But I was desperate enough to take the risk. The building itself wasn't much to look at. A 5-story brick block, probably built in the 70s, with a few rust stains running down from the window sills like permanent tears. The lobby smelled faintly of old carpet and pine sol, but when the landlord opened the door to apartment 4B, I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. It was clean, really clean. The walls were a fresh, if generic, beige. The hardwood floors, though worn, were polished. A small kitchenette was tucked into one corner, and the main room was just big enough for a bed, a desk, and the beat-up but clean couch the previous tenant had left behind. Light streamed in through a large window that overlooked the street. It was perfect. It was a home. "I'll take it," I said, probably a little too eagerly. The landlord was a guy named Mr. Albritton. He was a quiet man, maybe in his late 60s, with a face that seemed permanently set in a neutral, unreadable expression. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He just existed. He nodded slowly, his eyes seeming to look past me rather than at me. "Rent is due on the 1st. No loud parties. No pets," he recited in a monotone, as if he'd said it 1,000 times. "No problem at all," I assured him. "This is great. I really appreciate it." He just grunted in response, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. Along with the keys, he took out a single sheet of A4 paper. It was old, folded so many times the creases were dark and soft. The edges were yellowed and frayed. He flattened it out on the kitchen counter with his thick, calloused hands. "And this," he said, his voice dropping a little, just enough for me to notice. "These are the building rules. They are mandatory. You must follow them." He slid the paper towards me. His gaze finally met mine, and for just a second, I saw something in his eyes. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was more like a deep, profound weariness, as if he was tired of giving out this piece of paper. He tapped it once with his finger. "Mandatory," he repeated, then turned and left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. I stood there alone in my new apartment, the keys feeling heavy and real in my palm. My first real place, a sense of accomplishment, of starting a new chapter, filled me up. I felt like an actual adult. I laughed to myself, a little giddy. Then I looked down at the paper on the counter. The text was typewritten, the ink faded in places. It was titled simply, "Rules for Occupancy." There were only 3. 1. Under no circumstances are you to look out the front-facing window between the hours of 11 p.m. and sunrise. I blinked and read it again. That was weird. A prank? Maybe the landlord was deeply religious or something and didn't like people looking out at the city at night. I shrugged and read the next one. 2. If you hear classical music, specifically piano, playing in the hallway, you must immediately play your own music or turn on your television at a high volume. Continue to do so until the hallway music has ceased for at least 5 minutes. Okay, now this was definitely a joke. This sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. I could just picture the last tenant, some film student, probably, getting a laugh out of typing this up to mess with the next person. A lonely old lady playing her Chopin too loud, maybe? And the solution was to have a noise war? It was absurd, but the third rule was the one that made me pause. 3. Do not open your door for anyone after 10 p.m. Not for any reason. If they claim to be the police, building management, or a delivery person, do not open the door. We have no night staff. We will never send anyone to your door at that hour. This one felt a little less like a joke. It was specific. It had a strange, cold finality to it. We will never send anyone to your door at that hour. Still, it wasn't that crazy. This wasn't the best part of town. It was just a very, very stern way of saying, be careful. It was the combination of all 3 rules that was so bizarre. Don't look out the window, have a sound battle with a phantom pianist, and never, ever open your door at night. I chuckled and shook my head. The landlord, Mr. Albritton, must be a world-class eccentric. Or maybe he just liked to scare the new kids to make sure they behaved. It was the only explanation that made any sense. It was just a piece of paper. I picked it up, folded it along its tired creases, and walked over to the desk by the window. I opened a drawer, tossed the rules for occupancy inside, and shut it. Out of sight, out of mind. I had unpacking to do. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. I brought up boxes from my car, sweating and grunting my way up the 4 flights of stairs. I set up my bed, arranged my few books on a shelf, and connected my PlayStation to the small TV I'd brought. Every now and then, I'd see a neighbor in the hall. They were people like me, a young woman carrying groceries, 2 guys who looked like students laughing about something, an older man shuffling towards the elevator. They'd give a quick nod or a small, non-committal smile, but mostly everyone kept to themselves. It felt normal. It felt safe. By the time night fell, I was exhausted but happy. I ordered a pizza, a celebratory meal for my first night of independence. I sat on the floor, using a cardboard box as a table, and watched some mindless show on TV. The sounds of the city outside were a distant, comforting hum, the wail of a far-off siren, the rumble of traffic, the general white noise of millions of lives happening all at once. My window looked down on the street, where cars passed under the warm, orange glow of the streetlights. It all felt so wonderfully, beautifully normal. I thought about that stupid list of rules and smiled. Yeah, definitely a prank. I was so tired I didn't even bother to fully make the bed. I just threw a blanket over the mattress and collapsed. The pizza box was still on the floor, and my clothes were still in suitcases. But I was in my own space, and that's all that mattered. I fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the sounds of the city and the deep satisfaction of a day's hard work. Sometime later, in that deep, dark part of the night where you're completely lost to the world, a sound pulled me partway back. It was a click, a tiny, soft, metallic sound. It was dry and sharp. It came from the direction of the front door. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. I was instantly awake, every muscle tensed. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, straining my ears against the silence of the apartment. What was that? It sounded like a key being gently, carefully inserted into a lock. And then withdrawn. Just a single, exploratory click. I waited. 1 second. 10. A full minute. Nothing. There was only the silence of my room, the hum of the small refrigerator in the kitchenette, and the distant, muffled sounds of the city. No footsteps in the hall. No scratching. Nothing. My mind, still foggy with sleep, started to rationalize. It was an old building. Old buildings make noises. A pipe settling, the wood in the doorframe contracting in the cool night air, maybe a neighbor next door fumbling with their own keys. Yeah, that had to be it. Just a neighbor. I let out a long, slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart rate began to settle. It was nothing. I was in a new place, and my brain was on high alert, turning every unfamiliar creak into a threat. I rolled over, pulling the blanket up to my chin. It was nothing, just my imagination. I shut my eyes, determined to go back to sleep. But for a long time, I just lay there in the dark, staring at the vague outline of my front door. The thing about fear is that it's a flash flood. It roars in, fills up everything, and then, just as quickly, it can recede, leaving you standing in the mud, wondering if the whole thing even happened. The click at the door was like that. In the dead of night, it was a home invader, a ghost, the end of the world. But in the morning, with sunlight streaming in and the smell of fresh coffee in the air, it was a pipe. It was the neighbor. It was nothing. I told myself that over and over again for the next few days. I had a job to do, boxes to unpack, life to pretend I was assembling correctly. The city was a loud, clattering thing, and my apartment was my little quiet box in the middle of it all. I fell into a routine. Wake up, make coffee, log into my remote data entry job, stare at spreadsheets until my eyes burned, log off. In the evenings, I'd microwave a sad frozen dinner and watch action movies or play video games until I was tired enough to sleep. It was a lonely existence, but it was mine. It felt stable, and the memory of that piece of paper, the rules for occupancy, faded. It was buried in a desk drawer, both literally and figuratively. It was just a weird quirk of a weird landlord, a funny story I'd one day tell a friend, if I ever got around to making any. The intense, almost desperate warning of Mr. Albritton seemed absurd in the daylight. Life was aggressively normal. I'd pass my neighbors in the hallway, we'd exchange those tight, brief smiles city people give each other, and that was it. Nobody was playing phantom piano concertos in the hallway. Nobody was trying to impersonate the police at my door. And I, for one, was not looking out the window after 11 p.m., not because I was scared, but because I was usually either asleep or so engrossed in blowing up digital aliens that the outside world ceased to exist. That sense of security is a fragile thing, though. You don't realize how thin it is until something pokes a hole in it. My something came on a Wednesday night, about a week and a half after I'd moved in. I had a big project due, a rush job that involved transferring a mountain of garbled data from one ancient system to another. It was mind-numbing, soul-crushing work, the kind that makes you question every life choice that led you to that specific moment. I'd been at it for hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the dregs of a bag of stale chips. The rest of the building had long since gone quiet. The distant traffic outside had dwindled to the occasional lone car hissing by on the wet pavement. My back ached, my eyes felt like they were full of sand. I leaned back in my cheap office chair, letting it creak in protest, and stretched my arms over my head, groaning. It was then that I glanced at the small digital clock on my laptop screen. 11:47 p.m. Almost midnight, and in that tired, fuzzy state of mind, a thought surfaced, unbidden. Rule number 1. Under no circumstances are you to look out the front-facing window between the hours of 11 p.m. and sunrise. I actually let out a small, tired laugh. There it was, the dumbest, most arbitrary rule on the list. What was supposed to happen? Was I going to see a vampire? Cinderella's carriage turning back into a pumpkin? It was so ridiculous. In my exhausted state, it felt like a challenge. A stupid, meaningless challenge from a senile landlord, and I was just the person to prove it wrong. It was a tiny act of rebellion against the monotony of my work, against the absurdity of that list. A part of me, a very small and childish part, just wanted to peek. To see the big, scary nothing that was out there and have a good chuckle about it. So I did. I pushed my chair back, walked the few steps to the large window, and pulled the blinds aside. My apartment, 4B, looked down and across the street. Below, the sidewalk was slick from an earlier drizzle, reflecting the sickly orange-yellow of the streetlights in distorted streaks. A row of parked cars sat silent and dark. A few trash bags were piled up by a lamppost, waiting for morning collection. The whole scene was empty. Desolate, exactly what you'd expect a quiet city street to look like at almost midnight on a weeknight. I felt a little spike of satisfaction. See? Nothing. Just a street. I was about to turn away, to go back to my spreadsheet prison, when my eyes caught a detail that didn't fit. Across the road, standing in the deep shadows between two streetlights, was a person. It was just a shape, a silhouette. Too dark to make out clothes or features, but it was unmistakably a human form. And it was completely, utterly still. Not waiting for a bus, not checking a phone, not walking a dog. Just standing there. That was strange enough, but it was the posture that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The figure's head was tilted all the way back, as far back as a neck could bend. It was pointed directly up at the sky, or, more specifically, it was pointed directly at my window. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I was looking at them, and they were looking, in the most unnatural way I'd ever seen, right back at me. They weren't just glancing up. It was a fixed, deliberate, penetrating gaze, as if they were trying to see through the glass, through the walls, right into my skull. The sheer stillness of it was what was so terrifying. It was the stillness of a predator, not a person. People fidget. They shift their weight. They breathe. This thing didn't. A wave of pure, primal adrenaline shot through me. My heart, which had been plodding along tiredly, suddenly hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. This was wrong, on a fundamental level. Who does that? Who stands on a dark street corner in the middle of the night and stares up at a random apartment window like that? My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. It had to be a drunk. Or someone on drugs. Maybe they were just stargazing, and my window happened to be in their line of sight. But the angle was too specific. The intent felt too real. It felt personal. I flinched back from the window, my hand flying up to my mouth. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stray box and landing hard on the floor. My brain was screaming, "They saw you. They know you're there. They were waiting for you to look." I stayed on the floor for a second, my heart pounding in my ears. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, suffocating. I had to look again. I had to confirm it wasn't a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by caffeine and exhaustion. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I crawled back to the window on my hands and knees, feeling utterly ridiculous but too scared to stand up. I peered cautiously over the sill, my eyes darting to the spot between the streetlights. It was empty. The sidewalk was bare. The shadows were just shadows. There was nothing there, no sign that anyone had ever been there. It was as if the figure had just dissolved into the night air. I stayed there, crouched, for a full minute, scanning the entire street. Nothing, not a flicker of movement, just the empty cars and the wet pavement. A new kind of confusion washed over me, pushing the stark terror aside. Did I imagine it? I mean, I was exhausted. My eyes were playing tricks on me all day, making letters on the screen swim and blur. It was possible, wasn't it? I could have just seen a weirdly shaped shadow cast by a tree branch, or a couple of trash bags stacked in a strange way. My tired brain, primed by that stupid, spooky rule, filled in the blanks and created a monster. Yeah, that had to be it. That was the only explanation that made any sense. It was a waking dream. A micro-nap hallucination. I got to my feet, my knees a little shaky. I walked over to the window and deliberately, with more force than necessary, slammed the lock shut. Then I grabbed the cord for the blinds and yanked it down, letting the plastic slats clatter into place, plunging the room into near-total darkness, save for the blue glow of my laptop screen. I stood there in the dark, my back to the window, my own breathing loud in my ears. I told myself it was nothing. I repeated it in my head, a mantra against the lingering creepiness. It was nothing. You're tired. It was a shadow. Get back to work. I walked back to my desk and sat down, forcing myself to look at the spreadsheet. The numbers and letters seemed to mock me. I tried to type, but my fingers felt clumsy and stiff. I couldn't focus. The image of that silent, upward-gazing figure was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The worst part was the feeling. The unshakable, deeply unsettling feeling that even with the blinds closed and the lock engaged, a pair of unseen eyes was still out there in the darkness, fixed on my window, waiting. Just waiting. You know how you can convince yourself of anything if you try hard enough? That was me for the entire week after I saw the man on the street. It was a masterclass in self-deception. Every morning, I'd wake up and my first thought was, it was a shadow. It was a trick of the light. You were exhausted. I'd repeat it like a prayer while the coffee maker sputtered to life. And you know what? It worked. Sort of. Life has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of fear. The daily grind is the best anesthetic there is. I had spreadsheets to populate, emails to answer, and a mountain of cardboard boxes that weren't going to unpack themselves. The memory of that unnaturally tilted head, that fixed stare, began to feel less like a real event and more like a scene from a bad horror movie I'd half-watched. The sheer, aggressive normality of my life walled it off. I'd nod to the woman in 4C as she left with her yappy little dog. I'd hold the door for the young couple in 4A who were always carrying groceries. They were all normal. The building was normal. That creepy, hand-typed list of rules from my landlord, Mr. Gable, was just the ramblings of a lonely old man with a flair for the dramatic. I'd effectively relegated the whole experience to the junk drawer of my mind, right alongside old anxieties and forgotten nightmares. And that's where it stayed for 8 solid days. I was winning. I was a rational adult living in a rational world. The monsters, I told myself, were all on my laptop screen, digital demons to be vanquished with a click of the mouse before I went to bed. The night it happened was a Tuesday. It was different from the night of the window incident. I wasn't overworked or running on fumes. In fact, it was the opposite. I'd finished my work early, ordered a pizza, and spent a couple of hours watching a mindless action movie. It was around 10:30 p.m. I was feeling relaxed, content even. The pizza was gone, the movie was over, and a pleasant, drowsy fatigue was setting in. I went through my nightly ritual, brushed my teeth, changed into a pair of shorts and an old t-shirt, and checked that the front door was locked. The deadbolt slid home with a satisfying, solid thunk. Safety. I was in the middle of my small living room, about to turn off the light and head to bed, when I first heard it. It was faint, so faint, at first, that I wasn't sure I was hearing it at all. It was music, a piano. The notes were clear and deliberate, weaving a melody that was beautiful but soaked in a deep, profound sadness. It sounded old, like something you'd hear in a black and white film. A Chopin nocturne, maybe. It was coming from outside my apartment, from somewhere down the long, carpeted hallway. My first thought was, a neighbor has good taste. It was a little late to be playing, but the walls in this place were pretty thick. I could only just barely hear it. It was actually kind of nice, a melancholy soundtrack to the end of my day. I stood there for a moment, listening, and then a cold little stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. My brain, without my permission, pulled a file out of that mental junk drawer. Rule number 2. If you hear classical music from the hallway, no matter how faint, you must immediately turn on a television or stereo to the loudest possible volume. Do not stop until the music is gone. I blinked. The rule, which had seemed so utterly insane just a day before, now felt present. The air in the room suddenly felt colder. The soft, sad notes of the piano no longer sounded beautiful. They sounded predatorial, but I fought it. I literally shook my head, as if to dislodge the foolish thought. Don't be an idiot, I whispered to myself. My hand had instinctively gone to the TV remote on the coffee table. I pulled it back. What was I going to do? Blast the late-night infomercials at full volume and get an angry knock from every resident on the floor? I'd be the crazy new tenant. Mr. Gable hadn't said why. It was just a command, devoid of context. It was probably one of his bizarre tests of obedience. No, I wasn't going to do it. It was just someone playing the piano. So I stood still, defiantly, listening. That's when I noticed the change. The music was getting louder. It wasn't a dramatic swell. It was a gradual, creeping increase in volume. It was the change in sound you hear when someone is walking toward you. The muffled, distant quality was gone. The notes were becoming sharper, clearer, as if the source was moving down the hallway, from the far end by the stairwell, getting closer. My heart started to pick up its rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. This wasn't just a neighbor in their apartment anymore. The sound was mobile. It was in the hallway. I could almost picture it, someone or something, carrying a sound source, maybe just a phone playing a recording, and walking slowly, deliberately, down the center of the worn floral patterned carpet. I could track its progress. It was passing the apartment of the young couple in 4A. Now it was getting to the door of the woman with the little dog in 4C. The music was so clear now, each sad note hanging in the air with perfect, chilling clarity. It felt like it was being performed just for me. My breath hitched in my chest. My entire body was screaming at me to grab the remote, to follow the stupid rule, to flood the apartment with noise and drown out that terrible, lonely piano. But I was frozen, caught in a feedback loop of fear and denial. It's nothing, it's just music, this is crazy, but it's getting closer, it's almost here. And then, it stopped. Not a fade out, it stopped abruptly, mid-note. The final, hanging chord was cut off as if by a switch. And the silence that rushed in to fill the void was 100 times more terrifying than the music had been. Because I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, exactly where it had stopped. Right outside my door, the silence was absolute. I couldn't hear a footstep, a cough, a breath. Nothing, just the frantic pounding of my own heart in my ears and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood motionless in the center of my living room, my eyes glued to the plain, white-painted wood of my front door. The brass deadbolt I had locked just minutes ago suddenly seemed as flimsy as tinfoil. Who was out there? Why had they stopped at my door? My mind raced, trying to find a foothold of logic in a sea of pure terror. Maybe they lived in 4B, the apartment next to mine, and they'd just reached their door. Yes, that had to be it. I just had to wait a second, and I'd hear the jingle of their keys, the sound of their own lock turning. I waited. 1 second, 2, 10. The silence remained unbroken, heavy, expectant, and then I heard it. It was the quietest sound I have ever heard, but it was louder than a gunshot. Click. It was the sound of a hand closing around the metal of my doorknob. Not turning it, just making contact. It was followed by a faint, dry, scraping sound. The sound of a palm, or maybe gloved fingers, slowly, deliberately, rotating against the brass. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. I was no longer a rational adult in a normal apartment building. I was prey. I was a mouse listening to the snake slide against the outside of its cage. Then came the pressure. I watched, my eyes wide with a horror I didn't know I was capable of feeling, as the doorknob began to turn. It moved with an agonizing slowness. A millimeter at a time. It wasn't the quick, rattling turn of someone trying to get in. It was a slow, testing, exploratory motion, a quiet, patient assertion of pressure. The metal of the lock mechanism inside the door groaned in quiet protest, a low, metallic squeal that drilled its way straight into my spine. Someone was on the other side of my door, 3 feet away from me, silently, patiently, trying to open it. The knob turned and turned until it couldn't go any further, stopped by the deadbolt. It was held there, at the very edge of its rotation, for an impossibly long time. A full 30 seconds, maybe a minute. An eternity of stretched, silent tension where the only things in the world were me, the door, and the unseen hand on the other side. My entire universe had shrunk to that single, terrifying point of connection. I was completely paralyzed, my feet were rooted to the floor, my throat was clamped shut. Every survival instinct screamed at me to yell, to grab something, to call 911. But I couldn't move, I could only watch the doorknob, a testament to the intruder's silent, unyielding presence. Then, as slowly and silently as it had begun, the pressure was released. The knob rotated back to its resting position with a soft, final click. And the silence returned, but this time, it was different. It wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was a shared silence. It was the silence of 2 people on opposite sides of a door, both knowing the other is there. I was staring at the door, and I just knew, that on the other side, someone was standing there, staring right back. Waiting, listening, just like me. The silence hung in the air like a thick, wet cloth. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was full of my own heartbeat, a frantic, pathetic drum against my ribs. It was full of the low hum of the refrigerator, a sound I'd never consciously noticed before but which now seemed deafeningly indifferent to my situation. And it was full of presence. The presence on the other side of that thin sheet of wood and paint. I was a bug under a glass, and the eye staring down at me was just on the other side of the door. My feet felt like they'd been nailed to the floorboards. I was trying to make my body do something, anything. Yell, grab my phone, run to the back of the apartment. But all the signals from my brain seemed to get lost on the way to my limbs. I could only stand there, a statue of a terrified man, my eyes locked on the brass doorknob. I was listening for a breath, for the scrape of a shoe on the hallway carpet, for the quiet jingle of keys that would tell me this was all a mistake, that it was just my neighbor in 4B. I prayed for the jingle of keys. What I got instead was an explosion. It wasn't a sound so much as a physical impact that traveled through the floor, up my legs, and into my teeth. The doorknob, my sole focus of terror, was seized and shaken with such pneumatic, unrestrained violence that it became a blur of gold. The rattle wasn't human, it was the sound of a machine trying to tear itself apart. The entire door shuddered in its frame, a deep, wooden groan accompanying the high-pitched shriek of metal on metal. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was a lifetime. It was the sound that shattered every last shred of denial I had left. This wasn't a test. This wasn't a prank. This was a physical assault. That sound, that terrible, violent rattle, broke the spell. It was like a bucket of ice water to the face. The paralysis vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, high-octane adrenaline that was so intense it made me feel sick. You don't think in a moment like that. There's no room for logic or planning. There's just a primal, animal part of your brain that takes over and screams one word: survive. My body moved. I stumbled back, my legs clumsy, my arms flailing for a second before they found their purpose. My eyes darted around the small living room, not seeing objects, but seeing weight and mass. The first thing was the desk. My cheap, particle board work desk. I grabbed it, the monitor and keyboard sliding off and crashing to the floor in a smash of plastic and glass I barely registered. It was heavier than I expected. I grunted, dragging it across the floor, the metal legs gouging 2 long, ugly scars in the laminate. I slammed it against the door. It wasn't enough. Behind me, the doorknob was being twisted again, hard, testing the deadbolt. The lock was holding, but the sound was obscene. A low, grinding squeal of metal under incredible strain. My eyes found the next thing. The bookshelf. It was a tall, narrow thing I'd assembled myself, filled with textbooks from college and a few paperbacks. It was my heaviest piece of furniture. "Come on," I whispered, the words a raw, ragged puff of air. My hands found purchase, and I pulled. It was like trying to move a boulder. The thing tilted, a cascade of books thudding to the floor around my feet. I didn't care. I put my shoulder into it, my cheek pressed against the cheap veneer, and heaved. It scraped forward, an inch at a time, a horrible, grating noise that was somehow a comfort because it was my noise, not theirs. I wedged it diagonally, one end against the wall, the other pressing the desk hard against the door. I scrambled back, tripping over a fallen textbook, and Crab walked away from the door. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my chest. I looked at my makeshift barricade, a flimsy desk and a wobbly bookshelf. It looked pathetic. It looked like a child's fort. But it was all I had. I huddled there, in the middle of my living room, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. The twisting on the knob stopped. For a second, there was silence again. A new kind of silence, filled with the sound of my own ragged breathing and the evidence of my frantic struggle. Did they give up? Did they see the door was blocked and just boom? The sound was nothing like the rattle. This was a deep, concussive blast that came from the center of the door. It was a sound of pure, focused destruction. I saw the cheap wood of the door bulge inward for a split second, a shower of white paint chips and tiny splinters exploding into my apartment. My pathetic barricade slid back an inch. The desk shuddered. The bookshelf wobbled dangerously. My ears were ringing. They weren't just trying the knob anymore. They had something heavy, a sledgehammer, a battering ram, something they had brought with them. Boom! Another impact, higher up this time. A visible crack, a dark, jagged lightning bolt, appeared on the surface of the door, running from the top hinge downwards. The sound of splintering wood was wet, sickening. It sounded like a bone breaking. The desk scraped back another inch. I could see the door itself physically bending around the deadbolt. It wasn't going to hold. That flimsy pine and hollow core, it was never meant for this. It was meant to keep out the honest. Boom! Another blow, right on the lock mechanism. The metal shrieked in protest. The bookshelf tilted, another avalanche of books tumbling down. Panic was a physical thing now. It was a sour, metallic taste in my mouth. It was a tightening in my chest so severe I thought I was having a heart attack. I was trapped. I was an animal in a cage, and the bars were being bent open one by one. I looked around wildly. My phone. Where was my phone? I saw it on the kitchen counter where I'd left it after ordering pizza. It was 10 feet away, but it might as well have been on the moon. Then, between the pounding, a new sound. It was quiet. So quiet, I thought I was imagining it, my mind cracking under the strain. But there it was again. It was a voice, a whisper. It slithered through the new crack in the door, a cold, venomous sound that cut through the noise of the assault. "We know you're in there." The voice was low, male, and unnervingly calm. It was a rasp. It wasn't a yell or a threat screamed in anger. It was a statement of fact. A predator telling its cornered prey that the game was over. The use of "we" hit me like another physical blow. This wasn't one crazy person. This was organized. My mind reeled. The man on the street. The music. It was all connected. It wasn't random. It was a process. And I had failed every single step. "Just open the door," the voice whispered again, closer this time, right at the crack. I could almost feel the hot breath puffing through the splintered wood. "Make it easy. For you. For us." That was it. That was the moment my panic tipped over into a different kind of terror, a cold, clear certainty of my own death. These people were going to get in. And when they did, they were going to kill me. The calm, businesslike tone of the whisper promised it. Boom. A sound like a firecracker going off. The top hinge of the door tore loose from the frame with a sickening pop. The door sagged inwards at an angle, held only by the deadbolt and the bottom hinge. Wood fibers, stretched and pale, were all that was left. My barricade groaned, the desk leg buckling under the new, uneven pressure. It was going to collapse. Any second now. My back was against the sofa. I was as far from the door as I could get. My eyes, wide with sheer, animal terror, scanned the room one last time. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. The kitchen was just an alcove. The bathroom had no window. The bedroom, the window. My gaze snapped to the bedroom doorway, and through it, to the single, large window on the far wall. The window I was never, ever supposed to look out of after 11 p.m. The window that looked out over the dark, narrow alleyway behind the building. An alleyway 3 stories down. Boom, crack, the sound of the deadbolt's housing splintering. The desk lurched sideways. The bookshelf toppled over with a final, deafening crash of wood and paper. The barricade was gone. There was now nothing between me and the splintered, sagging door but 10 feet of open air. Another blow would do it. One more. The thought was instant, born not of courage but of pure, unadulterated desperation. It was a choice between two certainties. The certainty of what was behind that door, the calm, whispering voice and the heavy tool in its hands. And the uncertainty of the window, the darkness, the fall. It wasn't a choice at all. As the final, catastrophic blow rained down on the door, splintering it from its frame, I lunged not away from the sound, but towards the back of the apartment. I ran for the bedroom. I ran for the window. My legs were moving before my brain gave the order. It wasn't a sprint, it was a scramble, a clumsy, falling forward lurch driven by a part of me that had existed long before language or reason. The only things in my universe were the dark rectangle of the bedroom doorway ahead and the symphony of destruction erupting behind me. Crack boom. The sound was final. It wasn't the dull thud of a hammer anymore. It was the sharp, explosive report of a deadbolt and its surrounding wood frame being torn from the wall entirely. That flimsy barricade I'd built, the one that felt so useless, had bought me maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds that were the difference between being in the living room when they came through and being in the bedroom. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Looking back would have meant accepting it was real, and some part of my mind was still desperately trying to pretend this was a nightmare I could wake up from. I burst into the bedroom, my socked feet sliding on the laminate floor. I almost went down, my arms windmilling to keep my balance. My shoulder slammed into the door frame, a jolt of dull pain that I barely registered. The window was right there, a pale gray square against the dark wall, reflecting the faint ambient light from the street outside. It was my only hope. It was a 3-story drop. Behind me, I heard them. Heavy, thudding footsteps on the living room floor. More than one set. The whisper wasn't lying. There were at least 2 of them. They moved with a heavy confidence, the sound of men who owned the space they had just invaded. I could hear the crunch of the splintered door under their boots. Check the back, a low voice grunted. Not the whisperer, a different one, deeper, more guttural. Panic clawed its way up my throat, tasting like acid. I threw myself at the window. It was a standard double-hung window, the kind you see in a million cheap apartments. It had a small, crescent-shaped brass latch in the middle where the 2 panes met. I fumbled for it, my fingers feeling like fat, useless sausages. The metal was cold and stiff. My breath was coming in ragged, pathetic sobs. Come on, come on, come on, I hissed, the words lost in the sound of my own frantic breathing. I twisted the latch. It wouldn't budge. It was stuck, painted over, rusted, frozen by years of disuse. It was the window they told me not to look out of. Of course, no one had opened it in a decade. Footsteps were coming toward the bedroom. Fast. I stopped trying to be gentle. I put the heels of both palms on the latch and shoved with everything I had. My hand slipped. I tried again, my nails digging into the old wood of the window frame, trying to get leverage. A nail bent back, a flare of sharp, white-hot pain shooting up my finger. I screamed, a short, choked sound. He's in here, the guttural voice, right outside the bedroom door. They were a few feet away. I had seconds, less. I abandoned the latch. I balled my hand into a fist. There was no thought, just a primal scream building in my chest. I drew my arm back and slammed my elbow into the top pane of glass. The explosion of sound was deafening, right next to my ear. It wasn't the clean shatter you see in movies. It was a messy, ugly crunch, a spiderweb of cracks erupting from the point of impact, followed by a shower of tiny, sharp cubes of glass. A few large, jagged shards fell inward, tinkling onto the floor. The cold night air rushed in, a shocking slap to my sweaty face. It smelled of damp pavement and exhaust fumes. I didn't waste time clearing the rest of the glass. I reached through the hole I'd made, my forearm scraping against the jagged edges, tearing my skin. I didn't feel it. I fumbled for the outside of the window, trying to find a way to push the bottom half up. My fingers found the lip of the frame. I pulled. It groaned, it scraped, but it moved. An inch, 2 inches, just enough. I heard them at the bedroom door. I didn't see them. I just felt their presence fill the doorway. I hooked my fingers under the raised pane and heaved with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength I didn't know I possessed. The window shot up with a screech of protesting wood and settled halfway open. It was enough. I threw one leg over the sill, my jeans catching on a shard of glass I hadn't seen. I felt a tug, then the fabric ripped. I was halfway out, my body contorted in the most awkward, vulnerable position imaginable. One leg in the cold night, one leg in the room with them. For a split second, I was frozen there, a perfect target. I remember seeing a shape moving in the darkness of my room, a large, bulky silhouette against the dim light from the living room. Then I was moving again, pushing off the floor with my remaining foot, scrambling through the opening like an animal escaping a trap. My shirt snagged, my hip banged hard against the frame, but then I was through. I was out, my feet landed on something solid. Barely. It was a ledge, a thin, concrete lip that ran under the window, maybe 5 inches wide. My back slammed against the cold, rough brick of the building. The shock of it knocked the wind out of me. My hands scrabbled for a hold, my fingers finding the rough texture of the window sill I'd just climbed out of. I was clinging to the side of the building, 3 stories up, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I didn't dare look down. I just stared at the brick wall of the building across the narrow alley, my knuckles white. I could hear them inside my apartment. A low curse, the sound of them moving toward the window. I braced myself. I thought they were going to reach out and grab me, pull me back in. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for a hand to close around my ankle. But it never came. Instead, a new sound cut through the night. It was from below, a woman's scream. It wasn't a scream of terror, but one of shock and anger. "Hey, what the hell are you doing up there?" My eyes shot open. Had she seen me? Then, a different sound joined hers. A sound that was music to my ears. It was distant at first, a faint, rhythmic cry in the city's hum. But it was getting louder, closer, echoing off the buildings. Whoop, 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 a police siren. The effect inside my apartment was immediate. The sounds of movement stopped. Dead silence for a heartbeat. I could feel it through the wall, a sudden stillness. The hunters had heard the bigger predators approaching. Then, a new kind of sound. Frantic, panicked. It wasn't the confident, heavy tread of invaders anymore. It was the sound of rats scrambling in a cage. I heard them running, their boots pounding on my floor, away from the bedroom. They were running back through the living room. I heard the crash of something else falling over, my lamp maybe. Then their footsteps hit the hallway carpet, and then the unmistakable, thundering echo of heavy feet taking the main apartment stairs 2 or 3 at a time. It was a desperate, panicked retreat. The sound got fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the approaching siren. And then, silence. The only sounds left were the siren, now deafeningly close, and my own ragged, heaving breaths, which turned to white puffs of vapor in the cold night air. I was still pressed against the brick, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the adrenaline crash, the shock, the biting cold. My muscles ached, the scrapes on my forearm and the gash on my leg started to throb, a dull, warm pain. Below, the alley was suddenly bathed in flashing light. Blue and red strobed across the brick wall in front of me, a chaotic, pulsing light show. I could hear car doors slamming, radios crackling with terse, official voices. I was safe. The thought was so foreign, so overwhelming, it didn't feel real. They were gone. I was alive. I was clinging to a ledge 3 stories up, but I was alive. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head and looked back through the shattered window into my bedroom. The flashing lights from below cast long, dancing shadows across the room. It was empty, but it was a ruin. The glass on the floor glittered like scattered diamonds. Through the doorway, I could see the living room. My bookshelf was on its side, books spilled across the floor like a paper and glue massacre. My desk was pushed against the wall at a crazy angle, and the front door, it was just a gaping, dark hole, a jagged frame of splintered wood hanging off a single, tortured hinge. They had been in there. They had walked through my home. They had stood feet from where I was now. I clung to the wall, trembling in the cold, bathed in the flashing lights of my own rescue. The initial wave of relief was already starting to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that had nothing to do with the height. I was saved. I was safe. But as I stared into the violated emptiness of my apartment, a single question echoed in the silent, ruined space, a question that was colder and sharper than any shard of broken glass. Who the hell were they? A voice from below, sharp and official, finally cut through my daze. "Hey, on the ledge, don't move, we're coming up." My knuckles were white, my fingers frozen to the rough brick of the window sill. I don't think I could have moved if I'd wanted to. The thought of letting go, even for a second, sent a jolt of vertigo through me that was almost as paralyzing as the fear. Below, the alley was a chaotic swirl of red and blue light. I could see the tops of 2 police cars, doors flung open. Figures moved in the strobing darkness, their voices a muddle of radio static and terse commands. It felt like an eternity before I heard them inside, not the heavy, predatory thud of the intruders, but the squeak of tactical boots on my laminate floor, the crunch of broken glass under their weight. "Police, we're coming to the window. Just hold on, kid." A uniformed officer appeared in the shattered frame. He was young, his face grim and all business in the pulsating light. He didn't waste time with a lot of questions. He just reached out. "Okay, easy now. Give me your hand. We're going to bring you back in." His grip was firm, strong. It was the first solid, non-threatening human contact I'd had in what felt like a lifetime. The simple act of it almost broke me. My whole body started to shake violently, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that came from the bone marrow out. He and another officer pulled me back through the window, my body clumsy and unresponsive. My feet landed back on my own floor, amidst the glittering shards of glass. I was back inside. The room was a disaster zone, worse in the harsh glare of their flashlights. Everything was overturned, broken, violated. The air was cold, smelling of the night and the dust from my own demolished furniture. They sat me down on the edge of my bed, the only thing still upright, and one of them put a coarse wool blanket over my shoulders. I just sat there, shivering, watching them move through my apartment. They were professional, methodical. They spoke into their radios, their voices low. No sign of the perpetrators. Forced entry, front door. Victim is, code 10 to 96. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't care. They asked me questions. What did I see? What did I hear? How many were there? I tried to answer, but my voice was a reedy, choked thing. My brain felt like it was wrapped in cotton. "Two," I managed to say. "I think I heard 2 voices. Could you describe them?" I shook my head. It was dark. They were just shapes. Big. I remember the whisper through the door, the guttural grunt from the hallway. But describing them? It was like trying to describe a nightmare. They were just pure menace in human form. The rest of the night was a blur of fluorescent lights and cheap, bitter coffee. They took me to the station, sat me in a small, pale green room to give a formal statement. I tried my best to recount the sequence of events, from the piano music to the final splintering crash of the door. The officer taking my statement, a tired-looking man with a graying mustache, typed it all out with a slow, 2-fingered peck, his face impassive. To him, this was just paperwork. Another Tuesday night. I kept thinking about the moment I looked out the window and saw that figure standing across the street, looking up. The piano music that stopped right outside my door. The doorknob turning. It didn't make any sense. It felt like something out of a horror movie, not a simple B&E. But how could I explain that to this bored cop? "Yeah, officer, so there's this weird list of rules." I couldn't. I'd sound like a lunatic. So I left it out. I just described a home invasion. It felt incomplete, like I was lying by omission, but it was the only story that sounded sane. They asked if I had anywhere to go. The thought of going back to that apartment, even with a new lock, was impossible. I called a friend from college, Mike, who lived across town. I woke him up, my voice still shaking as I tried to explain. He didn't need the details. He just said, "Jesus. Stay there, I'm on my way." I spent the rest of the night on his couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gaping black hole where my front door used to be. I heard the splintering wood, the whisper, "We know you're in there." The next morning, after Mike left for work, I knew I had to go back. I had to get my things. My laptop, my clothes, my passport. I couldn't live there another second, but my life was still scattered inside those walls. I took the bus back, the morning sun feeling unnaturally bright and cheerful. The city looked exactly the same, people heading to work, grabbing coffee. It felt like a deep, personal insult that the world could just keep turning after mine had been so completely shattered. The apartment building looked just as drab and normal as ever. The landlord had already boarded up my doorway with a rough sheet of plywood. A fat, new padlock hung on a hastily installed hasp. It looked temporary. It looked pathetic. The apartment in the daylight was somehow worse. The chaos was stark and pathetic. My books, my stupid, cheap furniture, my whole life, just junk strewn across the floor. I started moving mechanically, grabbing a duffel bag and just stuffing clothes into it. My hands were still shaking. Every creak of the floorboards from the hallway made me jump. I felt hunted. I felt exposed. That's when I heard a soft knock on the plywood. My heart flew into my throat. "Hello, Mr. Evans? It's Officer Miller. From last night?" It was the older cop, the one with the mustache. I fumbled with the padlock, my fingers feeling fat and clumsy, and pulled the plywood open. He was standing there, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. He gave me a sympathetic, tired smile. "Sorry to bother you, son. Just had a follow-up question. Mind if I come in for a second?" I nodded numbly and stepped aside, letting him into the wreck of my living room. He winced as he looked around. They really did a number on this place. "Yeah," I said. It was the only word I could manage. He took a sip of his coffee. "Look, my partner, he's by the book. But I've been on this beat for 20 years. I just wanted to tell you, don't beat yourself up, okay?" This wasn't random. I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? This area," he began, gesturing vaguely with his cup, "it's got its problems. We've been dealing with a crew for the better part of a year now. They're smart, cautious. They target people living alone, people who won't put up much of a fight. But the thing is, they don't just kick in a door and hope for the best." He paused, looking directly at me. His eyes were serious now. "They have a process, a way of testing a place before they hit it." A cold feeling, colder than the fear from last night, started to creep up my spine. "They test it?" I whispered. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "They'll try different things to see if anyone's home, and more importantly, what kind of person is home. They'll send someone to stand across the street late at night, just watching a window, to see if they get a reaction. A light going on, someone peering out. They might play some music in the hall, or make some other strange noise. See if the person inside blasts their TV, makes a commotion, shows they're not easily spooked." He shrugged. "They'll even have someone knock on the door late, say they're building security or something. They're checking you out, probing your defenses, the ones who don't react, who just hide and stay quiet. Well, to this crew, that's a green light. That's an easy target." My blood went ice cold. My breath hitched in my chest. I couldn't feel the floor beneath my feet. My gaze drifted from the officer's face to the desk, which was still pushed up against the wall. The drawers were all pulled out, their contents spilled onto the floor. But one thing had remained inside, tucked into the back corner of the top drawer. A single, folded sheet of A4 paper. Without thinking, I walked over, my movements stiff, robotic. I knelt down among the scattered pens and old receipts and picked it up. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unfold it. The cheap paper was crinkled and soft from age. Officer Miller was still talking, his voice a distant buzz in my ears. "So what I'm saying is, you probably didn't do anything wrong, they just got lucky, or unlucky in your case." But I wasn't listening. I was staring at the typed words on the page. The house rules. 1. Absolutely do not look out the window after 11 p.m. The figure across the street. He wasn't a ghost. He was a scout. He was waiting for me to look. And I had. 2. If you hear classical music playing from the hallway, immediately turn on a TV or any audio device to its loudest volume. The piano music. It wasn't a phantom. It was a test of my reaction, my nerve. And I had failed. I'd stayed silent, frozen in fear, signaling to them that I was alone, and that I was terrified. 3. Never open the door for anyone after 10 p.m., even if they claim to be management. They were checking, probing. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. This wasn't a joke from a weird landlord. This wasn't some silly superstition. This was a survival guide. It was a goddamn survival guide, written by someone who knew. Someone who had seen the scouts. Someone who had heard the music. Someone who had figured out the pattern. It was a warning, passed down from one tenant to the next, a desperate message in a bottle. And I had thrown it in a drawer. The real horror of the past 24 hours slammed into me, and it had nothing to do with a shattered door or a man with a weapon. It was the chilling, clinical realization that I hadn't been a victim of random, chaotic violence. I had been studied, I had been tested, and I had been selected. My rational, modern mind, which had dismissed the rules as foolishness, had been my undoing. I had walked through every single tripwire they'd set, announcing my presence and my vulnerability as clearly as if I'd hung a sign on the door that said, "Come and get me." I looked down at the paper in my trembling hands. This list of rules wasn't the craziest thing about the apartment. It was the sanest. In this part of the world, in this quiet, unassuming building, it was the only thing that was real. It was a shield, and I had thrown it away. The most terrifying monsters weren't the ones who kicked down your door. They were the ones who handed you the instructions on how to beat them, and you were too smart to listen.